Welcome to this chess video, everyone. Here we'll be discussing the importance of the bishop outside the pawn chain, like what we have here, and basically why this is not necessarily the best idea in all positions. I think a lot of people just naturally want to develop their pieces, especially their bishops, outside the pawn chain, because they understand the importance of what is called a bad bishop. If you don't know what a bad bishop is, then you can watch this chess video here. You can look for this on my channel, and it'll kind of review yourself of the ideas. But I think a lot of people overestimate this, and they don't value enough the importance of what's called the bishop pair in chess. And so here we're going to show why keeping the bishop inside the pawn chain might actually be preferred in some lines. So our first example will be with the Slav defense, and then afterwards we're going to show an example with the Caro-Kann, and you'll see the very similar nuances that come up. So real briefly we'll show how you get to this position, and so oftentimes it'll go as d4, d5, c4, c6, and then for white, developing either the knight to f3 or c3, and then black will play knight f6, and then white will play the other knight. In this case, the main line for the regular Slav defense goes bishop to f5. And we're going to show some examples on what ends up happening. White will play something like e3, black will play e6, closing the bishop outside the pawn chain. But now here comes the thing that you have to be aware of. There's many different lines. This move may not come immediately, but at some point, usually white will end up playing knight to h4. And after knight h4, this bishop has to go somewhere. And of course, if we go back to g6, then we just possibly give up the bishop pair, as they may capture our bishop. If we go here to e4, well, once again, they can just capture bishop. And anywhere, here, of course, they would just take our bishop for free. And so really, what's our only way to save this piece? Well, we could try bishop to g4 because it is defended by the knight. That looks like a way to save the bishop pair, but in fact it really doesn't, because white will just play queen to b3, now attacking this pawn, and if black addresses that, keeps queen tension here, well then they just play pawn to f3. And now this bishop is going to have to go back, and they can play pawn g4, kick the bishop again, and now we can see that in this position, at some point whenever they feel like it, they can exchange off this bishop. And so, is this the worst thing in the world? No. Actually, this position is roughly equal. So if you know how to handle this and you're comfortable with it, then by all means fine. But I think a lot of players are surprised because they see how many pawns white has pushed. They think that white is a pawn pusher, and they get a bit upset here. But all of their moves have come with tempi, and black really doesn't have a ton of development for it. Here we can see that right now, black has 3 pieces developed, and white has 3 pieces developed. So really, there isn't really a big advantage here. And white pushing the pawns has actually gained some really valuable space. Now, the importance of this video is that we're about to lose the bishop here. And so, for the most part, that is something we might want to avoid. So now let's go back and let's show some other variations of what could possibly happen. So now returning to our key position here, where bishop f5 was the Slav defense, the regular way we would play it. But what if we go to, say, bishop to g4? Well, if we go bishop g4 in a lot of lines, they'll play knight to e5. And it might surprise a lot of players that the top engine move is actually this really interesting bishop back to c8. And it's the same idea where they actually want to keep the bishop inside the pawn chain, and they don't really want to develop it outside, which is kind of interesting. But let's say that instead of retreating all the way, let's say that hypothetically you want to keep it outside the pawn chain, right? The whole point of this is to bring the bishop out and not really play it inside the pawn chain like you would with the French defense. So let's say they go to f5. Well, now white can actually trade on d5, and whether black takes back here with the pawn or the knight, in both cases, we'll end up with a situation where white is slightly better. Now, I'm going to take with the pawn because even though subjectively not best, it actually shows a really cool motif that kind of is instructional to this. White will take the center with e4, and if you take it, black is actually losing here. White is over +1, and it is just because they have so many threats. Now, here specifically, we have bishop to c4 is a very big threat. Also, this bishop going all the way to b5 is a threat, because it's a very dangerous check, and any place that we block here, this knight is also covering those squares. And in addition to that, we also have queen to a4 as a check that could add more pressure to the pin, and in some lines we even have queen b3 putting pressure on this pawn. And so you can see that's a lot of arrows here, and a lot of things that black has to be on the lookout for. And simply put, black cannot defend against all of these, and white actually has the advantage. But, of course, let's not go back to c8, and let's not go back to f5. Well, now, we could try going back to h5, right? That looks like it might save the bishop pair. But if you play this, well, once again, white can capture in the center, and you can capture back, and I'll just show a long variation. Again, this could go many different ways, but here's one good example of how we'll try to keep the bishop pair, and you probably won't get away with it. because they can play g4, bishop g6, and again, they could take here, and already we've lost the bishop here. But I want to go a little further and just kind of show how instructional this really is, because they can actually play h4, threatening to trap our bishop outright, so it's not just a trade. And so now where do you go? Well, if you go here, you're losing the bishop, and no other squares are safe. And so it looks like you're close to losing it. So what black has to do is they have to capture on c3, removing the defender. That way this square becomes available for their bishop. And white can capture back. Now you play the bishop here, but pawn f3 comes. It kicks the bishop to the only square it's not lost, bishop to d5. White grabs the center with e4. They bring their bishop back, and now rook b1, taking the half-open file here. And already, white is much better because this bishop has wasted so many moves getting kicked around, just trying to hold on to the bishop here. Now, if you try and take the a2 pawn, then you're actually losing really quickly. If you take here, white can just capture on b7. They've gotten their material back, so material is equal. You can try and kick the rook, but now they'll return the favor by kicking our bishop. And if we come all the way back to e6, the only square it looks safe, then white has pawn to d5. And we can bring our bishop back to d7, but this is extremely passive to black. White has gained a ton of space, and white's king is actually pretty safe in the center. Maybe they'll play king f2 in some lines, maybe they'll castle, but the point remains, black has no pieces that is attacking white's king. And if we look at the engine here, this is already over +3. They evaluate in white's favor. So really, it's just extremely difficult to hold these kind of positions, and you're already getting run over. Now, if positions like these worry you and you don't know how to fight against people who actually just push pawns without threats, then you might want to check out this video I have on fighting the pawns, where Magnus Carlsen actually starts pushing pawns himself. And so what are we supposed to play? If we cannot keep our bishop here by bringing the bishop outside the pawn chain, what should we play? Well, in all of those lines, bishop to f5 is a main line for a reason. It is a good move, and there's nothing wrong with this. Grandmasters have played it for many years. But you do have to be aware that in some lines you may have to give up the bishop pair. And so what it comes down to is your compensation for that bishop pair. Now, if you don't want to give up the bishop pair at all, might I suggest another possibility, which is on move 4 here, we can play pawn to e6. And this is known as the Semi-Slav Defense, with the whole point that we actually maintain this bishop inside the pawn chain. Now, although this is a bad bishop for the time being, at least we keep the bishop pair. And by keeping the bishop pair, long term we have some potential on how to use that. If you want a video on the importance of the bishop pair, you can check out this video on my channel here. But now let's get to the example with the Caro-Kann that I mentioned, because really we have the same concept where black will want to develop the bishop outside of the pawn chain. So the Caro-Kann starts with e4, c6, d4, and d5. And specifically I want to show the advanced variation, which is pawn to e5. And the main line for this is indeed bishop to f5, with the same idea as the Slav. We want to get this bishop outside the pawn chain. We'll play e6, and hopefully this bishop will be a really nice developed piece. Now white could continue with knight to f3. We could close the bishop outside the pawn chain. Maybe they'll play a developing move like bishop e2, just trying to get castled. And probably black will also try and keep developing, something like knight to d7. Now say white castles. In this case, black probably wants to play the move h6, which is a very thematic idea, very similar to the London, and it's got the same purpose, where in the London system, they want to retreat that bishop in the event of knight h4. And we have the same thing here, where this h6 move is simply to create an escape square for this bishop if it is ever threatened. Now what happens if black just keeps developing and we don't take that one move into consideration? Well, if they keep developing, they might play a nice move like knight to e7, but then here comes knight to h4 at some point. And if you move the bishop to e4, now knight to d2. And once again, black is losing the bishop here. And so the whole point of getting your bishop outside of the pawn chain isn't really as helpful if then you end up losing that piece to a trade. And so if your idea was trying to develop pieces, you have to consider, is that necessarily what you want? Now again, both of these are fine, whether you decide to keep the bishop inside the pawn chain or outside, but I think a lot of people automatically just develop it outside the pawn chain and don't really consider the possibility of leaving the bishop inside the pawn chain and maintaining the bishop pair. But I don't want this decision to be automatic, where you just develop a piece just for the sake of what you think is good development. Because as we see here, we've developed the bishop outside the pawn chain, and white is about to capture it, and we're going to lose that bishop pair. So if you care that much about the bishop pair, consider leaving it inside the pawn chain. Maybe an interesting move would be on e5 here. For black, on move 3, they might even consider the interesting idea pawn to e6 right away, and they just don't care about the bishop pair. Maybe you'll go like bishop d3, c5, c3, continue developing knight c6, knight f3, and then just ignoring all of white's play and just playing developing with black, knight g to e7. And here black will just keep developing, playing very solid moves, and long term they keep the 2 bishops, which could be an asset later down the road. Now of course white never really wants to capture on c5, so we don't mind the knight is blocking the bishop recapture here, because if this ever happens we'll just play the knight to g6, and there'll be a lot of long term pressure to win back this pawn, or possibly capture here, but in both cases the white center has been much destroyed because this pawn really belongs here on d4, trying to secure this e5 pawn. Now you'll probably think twice before developing a bishop outside of the pawn chain. Thanks for stopping by, I'll see you in the next chess video.